Namaskara, hello, and welcome to the 2020 edition of the Bengaluru Poetry Festival, where we crossed oceans digitally to bring you poems and conversations with the best of the best. I'm Shikha Malaviya, and today I'm in conversation with Amit Majmudar, who is an award-winning poet, novelist, essayist, translator, and full-time practicing diagnostic nuclear radiologist. Amit is the first poet laureate of the state of Ohio and the author of several books, his latest being Dothead, his third poetry collection, and God's Song, a verse translation of the Bhagavad Gita with commentary. He is also the editor of the anthology Resistance, Rebellion, Life, 50 Poems Now. His first novel, Partitions, was named the best debut fiction of 2011 by Kirkus Reviews. Amit has been awarded the Donald Justice Poetry Prize and the Pushcart Prize, and his work has appeared in numerous publications, including the New York Times, the New Yorker, and the 11th edition of the Norton Introduction to Literature. His latest poetry collection, What He Did in Solitary, by Knopf, will be launched here in the US on August 18th, and his forthcoming book in India is a translation of Kabir's poems in rhymed verse called The Mystical Rhymes of Kabir. Amit, it is a real pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very honored.
Thank you. And so I think, I wanted to start off by saying that I think many South Asian or Indian parents whose children are poets and writers are going to watch this conversation and say, see, he's a doctor as well as a writer. And I guess you could argue that there has been a tradition of sorts, or there are others like yourself, like C. Dale Young, Rafael Campo, William Carlos Williams. So tell us a little bit about your literary journey. How does a doctor come into poetry, or is it the poet who came into medicine?
It was the latter. It was the poet who went into medicine. Medicine's kind of just our family profession. So both my parents are doctors. Mm-hmm. My sister also went into kind of an accelerated medical course. And then I ended up going to the same one, kind of following in her footsteps. And really, for me, it was very much, poetry was something that I started out doing very early. I'm talking like 12, 13 years old. I was obsessed with it, and, poetry and prose, both.
Right.
I was obsessed with it from a very early age. And I didn't necessarily feel confident that it was going to be the ideal career for me from just a purely practical standpoint, from a career standpoint. So I just made a practical decision that I would go into medicine and do that, but kind of do that, with one part of my mind, but then kind of save my soul and my passion and my love for literature. And that was good because it kind of kept it sacred for me, because I really don't like, and part of it was that I really don't like reading things and writing things in an educational or pedagogical format. Right. So when I was in college, I only did 2 years of college. I kind of crushed all the curriculum into 2 years, or like the accelerated thing that I was on. And then I did 2 years of college and went straight to medical school. And then, I had the chance to do some literary classes. So I was kind of interested in Latin literature at that time. And so my guidance person was like, you should at least take some literary course or literary class. So I actually went to the Latin literature and translation course. On the first day, they gave you this huge reading list. And I'd read some of those things that I liked. Other things I tried, and I was like, I don't want to read that. I don't want to read those speeches of Cicero. But, with that, I would have to read those things. And so I was kind of like, I'd rather just keep this sacred and keep this to myself, read whatever I want to read, whenever I want to read it. And then when I have to kind of force myself to just do work, it'll be the sciences. And it ended up working out well. I kind of chose my field, which is radiology.
Right.
Because that field is something that you can kind of leave at work. And there's not too much in the way of you're not constantly interacting with people and having the emotional toll of that. It's pretty clean. It's it's something that increasingly with technology you can do remotely, which has really helped during the coronavirus pandemic that we're in right now. So it ended up being the right thing. It could have gone wrong in a whole bunch of different ways. I'm sure if I decided that I had to become like a cardiothoracic surgeon, I wouldn't have had the time to do all the various books that I do. But I kind of knew in advance that I wanted to be a writer. So I was able to make decisions along the way that were conducive to the writing life.
That's fantastic. And I mean, I have real admiration for that, because it isn't easy. I mean, and to see the output that you have, the amount of books that you've published already, it's not an easy thing, whether you are a doctor or not, right? And so, I mean, hats off to you for being able to, do what you're doing.
I mean, I'm kind of monomaniacal about that. I mean, I basically have, very few things in my life that I focus really, really hard on, and then I let everything go. Everything else is like not there. So like I have family. I obviously have to spend a certain number of hours in a day, career radiology.
Right.
And then I work out every day. And then other than that, it's just literature. I don't watch very much television. I don't watch sports. I don't follow sports.
Right.
I don't know who was in the Super Bowl last year. I won't know. It's news to me. In fact, the last time I used to follow sports was like in 4th grade. So like my kids will mention like a team to me and I'll be like, LA used to have a different team when I was growing up and I have no idea. Tennessee has a team now. Like it's all completely a strange world to me.
Right.
So in a lot of ways, I'm kind of like, not there, as far as all these other things are concerned. And, I have very, very, small number of really intense friendships. And then other than that, like there's not, I don't really encounter anybody else,
Right.
And so I am pretty solitary. I guess that's, other than my family and my, 2 or 3 really, really tight friends, I don't really encounter very many people. So.
Well, speaking of solitary, your poetry collection that's about to come out, it's called What He Did in Solitary. And it's coming out at a time when the world has been sheltering in place for the past 5 months. And
right.
A world which has been witness to a deadly pandemic, police brutality, protests, economic upheaval, a health crisis, and more. And I'm sure this is not the scenario you pictured in ushering in a new book, right?
So, and you know what? I actually, the timing could have been worse. So I also published a novel in India right before March, which is right when the lockdown started over there. Because I also published novels over in India in kind of like a parallel career, over there. And my wife published her debut novel. I happen to have it right here, so I might as well plug it.
Congratulations to her.
My wife's debut novel. It's called The Torchbearers. She's a YA novelist. She just randomly.
That's fantastic.
Her first finished draft of her first attempt at fiction, she submitted unagented to the biggest publishing house in India, Penguin Random House in India. She got it published. Now the sad thing is this came out like the week of lockdown. Mine came out like 2 weeks before lockdown. Hers came out the week of lockdown. She didn't actually hold her own book in her hands until last month.
Right.
because all the warehouses were shut down.
Yeah, and they couldn't ship it. And what's your novel that came out? Which one is that? My
novel that came out in India is called Soar, and it's one of my personal favorites. I actually wrote it back in 2011, but I just put it in a drawer, and then I randomly was like, because I was like, no one's really going to get into this here in the United States. But then when I hooked up with Penguin Random House India, I was like, I got some old stuff here that you're going to like. And I sent it to them, and they loved it. And it's actually a novel. It's a comic novel it's tragicomic. And it's about these 2 soldiers in World War I, because the British colonial army sent Indian soldiers over to Europe to fight on the Western Front.
Right.
So I have these 2 soldiers. They're best friends. One's a Hindu and one's a Muslim. And they go up in a surveillance balloon, which was this big balloon. It would be tethered to the ground, and then the tether breaks, and so they go off in this balloon, in this hot air balloon. They go sailing over the Western Front of World War I, and they have all these religious conversations. So it was very well received in India. And so Telegraph India actually compared it to Waiting for Godot, where there's these 2 guys and they're having these existential conversations. And I was like, that's exactly what I was going for. Thank you very much. And unfortunately it came out during a time where, everything was in upheaval.
Right.
It's out there, if anyone's interested. I know this is going to be in India, so Soar. And then my wife's book came out with Puff in India, and that's called The Torchbearers. If you only get one, get hers. So
Oh, look at that. I mean, that's fantastic. A literary family. But
yeah, definitely a literary family. And our 12-year-old is now decided that he wants to be a novelist too. So he wakes up every day at 7 in the morning.
blood.
He's just down there. He's down there. I hear the keyboard, and he's just going. He just goes at it. He just.
Fantastic. Oh my gosh, that's amazing. And hopefully we'll get to see his book as well.
if only we're going to self-publish it, but he's going to get out there at some point.
I'm sure. Yeah. So, okay, coming back to your collection, What He Did in Solitary. So tell us about the title of this book. You know, this is a title that will really resonate with all of us right now. And if you could also read the title poem for us, that would be
sure. So What He Did in Solitary is part of a series of poems or a sequence of poems that deal with solitary. So one is What He Did in Solitary, one other is What He Dreamed in Solitary, and the third is What He Drew in Solitary. And those are the ones that finish out the book. And so naturally there's going to be a large emphasis on them, but I didn't actually know that we were going to be in quarantine the next year, because this was all put together a while back. There were a whole bunch of different titles that I was thinking about calling it, but my editor at Knopf, Deb Garrison, in one of her emails that we were going back and forth, she's like, you know, you maybe want to think about What He Did in Solitary, full title. And at that time, neither of us knew what was going to happen, but it just seemed right at the time. And I went with it, and it has taken on this sort of weird relevance.
Right.
In any case, I'll read it. It's called What He Did in Solitary. And basically the form of it is just a list of these things that this guy in solitary confinement is doing to kind of pass the time, as it were. And then I'll just read it. So What He Did in Solitary. Named all the state capitals, sang as much of the miseducation of Lauryn Hill as he had tattooed on his eardrums, which was all of it. Tugged, instead of magician's scarves, blinking Christmas lights from somewhere deep inside him, and strung them in spirals up and down his prison bars. Realized Edmond Dantes in the Chateau d'If was imprisoned in the castle of possibility. Listed the 5 best Mexican places he'd eaten at. Thought hard about the first love he ever touched until the scent reappeared on his index and middle. Pared his nails with his teeth and kept going until he bled. Used the blood to paint the butterfly from Papillon on his breastbone. Laid his ear on different parts of the floor and walls to see if footsteps or earthquakes might transmit from somewhere. Plugged the drain with 2 fistfuls of hair and filled the sink with water, because every garden walling in and innocent should have a bird feeder. Played with himself, lost interest. Listed all the presidents, palmed his scalp to feel his hair grow. Thumbed his eyelids up so his helium-filled eyeballs float out of their sockets on yellowish neural tethers. Scraped the bricks with his teeth to fill his navel with brick grit so that one of his fingernails, potted, might grow into a hand. Did 100 squats. Imagined himself in his boyhood's public library so hard the bricks became the spines of Tolkien novels stacked to the ceiling. Hunted the corners and under the cot for a spider to talk to. Monologued mightily, making appeals to logic and mercy that would have gotten him acquitted. Prayed, hands together on his knees for deliverance from his own company. Shouted at the ceiling, took a deep breath, pursed his lips, pinched his nose, and blew out, bursting both tympanic membranes with a sound so gunshot-like it reminded him of home. Made shapes with his tongue in the mirror until his tongue finally, after hundreds of attempts, forked. Stood on his hands until he got a headache, sobbed. Realized he'd left out John Tyler and listed all the presidents again. Whistled and patted his thighs as if his beagle Ben were running back to him. Spoke both parts in a stage play of his own making about the Rodney King riots. Lunged at the saran-wrapped sandwich slid through the slit in his cell door, hoping hungrily to glimpse his jailer's human hand. Congratulated himself on making it to lunch. peeled the saran wrap off the sandwich, ate. Complete with a reference to riots, which I was also oddly, timely now.
Exactly. When I read that poem and the whole sequence, it was really uncanny. I was just thinking that there's so many people who, I mean, even if we're sheltering in place like you and me, we have our families, and there are people who are absolutely alone. And, what goes on in your head? And when I read that poem, and I just thought, you couldn't have known when you wrote this, that this is the type of world we were going to be in. And so which also brings me to two other poems of yours I want to mention. So in your previous collection, which is, behind me, Dothead, what a fantastic cover, I have to say. So there's a poem called Pandemic Ghazal, and which seems like a premonition of sorts. And you wrote that the book came out in 2016. So
I wrote it well before then. It was like 2015, 2014, yeah.
And then there's a poem in what he did in solitary called Virus, which I believe you wrote that also before all of this happened?
I wrote that back in 2017, yeah. You can find it online, actually. I wrote it years ago.
So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about these poems, that why did you write them? And then, of course, read one or both of them for us.
Right. I think the Pandemic Ghazal is interesting because that was prompted entirely by the form of the ghazal. So the ghazal, as you know, and as Indians know better even than Americans for sure, it has this recurring refrain, right? And so the interesting thing, or rather what the neuron that fired in my head was that a virus is intent on replicating itself, okay? Right. And that is its raison d'etre, is to replicate itself. Right. And so when I thought about this, I thought about how the ghazal form has this refrain in it that's constantly replicating.
The same thing, right, right.
So it's really the same thing the virus does. And so the Pandemic Ghazal I wrote purely to create, or rather upon understanding the relationship between the sort of viral nature of the refrain of the form of the ghazal. And so from that, I wrote a ghazal about a virus, and the virus itself was the refrain, which, as you can hear in a moment, endlessly replicates itself. So you'll hear the word virus over and over again because the virus is multiplying.
Right.
So this is Pandemic Ghazal. Virus infinitely versatile. Virus of guardrail, iPod, turnstile. Virus eager to go the extra mile. Virus seaborne, colonizing the enchanted isles. Virus airborne, whistling all the while. Virus discreetly flashing holster and assassin smile. Virus smuggling fever up the Red Nile. Virus of folk song, urban legend, official denial. Virus squatting on the sky, chameleon style. Virus in New York City, scheming how to make a pile. Virus never standing trial. Virus believing God gave it guile. Virus making a killing and making it in style.
Wow.
And again, that has a reference to New York City.
I know, I was just about to say that.
Yeah, and actually the Red Nile in my head, when I wrote the Red Nile, that's actually means like the bloodstream, basically. Right. The Red Nile, there's actually the White Nile and the Blue Nile. Those are the actual geographic Niles. But I actually wrote about the Red Nile. I referred to the Red Nile referring to the bloodstream. And coronavirus, novel coronavirus, is primarily hits the vascular endothelium, which is very interesting as well. It has one of its mechanisms is to actually hit the blood vessel, which is another weird premonitory reference that I had no idea.
But I read that, like, if someone were to hear this without knowing the context or when you wrote it, they would not believe that you wrote this,
I know, it's uncanny, very uncanny and spooky, frankly. Spooky is a word.
And then even your poem Virus, which is in your latest collection, that as well,
Yeah, that one is not a ghazal, if I remember correctly. No. I'll have to take. It's been so long. But yeah, Virus is just, it's just something that I've always found that fascinating. I've always found viruses fascinating. They're just this pure monomaniacal thing. They have this one thing that they always want to do, which is replicate. And what's interesting to me is that, so at the very end of the poem about the virus,
Right.
I have this quote from Kierkegaard, which is, purity of heart is to will one thing. And that's basically the virus. The virus is pure of heart.
And that is the line which I actually wanted to mention, because when I read that line, that just like blew me away, because that is what it is. That is the essence of it. And the whole poem is sort of like a meditation, on what is the virus. And I was like, wow. I mean, I probably wouldn't have been interested on a poem about the virus had we not been in the time we are in right now,
Right. And, and it's kind of interesting, like this urge to replicate it. It's like, and that monomaniacal thing. Now, Kierkegaard wrote that line in reference to religion.
Right.
And it's very interesting to me that, like, religions, sort of proselytizing religions, have this drive to replicate, their ideas, and to propagate their ideas, and to also spread virally, and also to turn everybody into members of their particular, religion. There's weird parallels, mind viruses and respiratory viruses there's uncanny similarities, and there's a reason why we use that term so often, going viral.
Right.
There's a reason, because it's real,
Well, one thing which I really love about your work, and which I noticed in your latest collection, is that the connections you make, they're so startling at times. And I just want to talk a little bit more about what he did in Solitary. It is a hefty book. It's 178 pages, but it's a very deep one, full of questioning and introspection. And it has a myriad of themes: identity, race, culture, family, nature, literature, history, mythology, and they all sort of crisscross each other. And I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I also felt, though, there was a very primal feel in what he did in Solitary, this wild animal energy, return to nature. And even though your poems and the way you write, your poems are very, in my opinion, very elegant, and in some ways restrained, because it seems like you really love, form also. But you're in for a ride from the very first poem, which I really enjoyed, and it evoked things for me growing up in the Midwest.
Right, a very Midwestern kind of Indian-American poem, for sure. Yeah,
exactly. So it really brought a lot of memories up for me, and I could really connect with it. And I love that it's called The Adventures of Amit Majmudar, and I would love if you could read that for us.
Sure. And that kind of refers to the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, and those great works of, like, boyhood. And instead, I had, like, a very tame boyhood of books and studying and everything. And so that's kind of where this came from. It's called The Adventures of Amit Majmudar. Never laid a snare for nothing. Never caught a bullfrog. Broke my slingshot wishbone wishing. Never had a smoke. Never clipped a baseball card to thutter in the spokes. My fist clenched an ink pen, and I learned what to think when, and never swore no honest Injun, and never spat and never struck. Where you gone, Tom? Where you at, Huck? I call myself a man today, though I've never been a boy, and dug for treasure in the woods or lost myself in play, feared dead for 7 days until I showed up by my grave and made a sniffling town rejoice. I could have been a pirate, Mama, at least a Robin Hood, but I was always up to something employable and good. And now I'm down here in this cave, crying to be saved, though I reckon I am stuck. Where you gone, Tom? Where you at, Huck?
I love that. I mean, and the rhyme and the playfulness, and, like, it's a great way to begin your book. And so the book starts off like that, but this poem sort of hints at darkness, imperfection, but the further we progress, there's a breaking open of different selves that seem to be aware of one another and are sort of bouncing off each other. So in this beautiful, vast book that you've written, which poems are the closest to you here? And tell us about this study, or, you know, the study of the self, or the multiplicity of selves that you have these little prefaces before each section, right? And you have these like little meditations or something. I mean, I don't know what to call them, but on the self. So,
Yeah. Yeah, you know, I think that's a lot of what that book is. You kind of nailed kind of like the nature of the book, which is that because it's what he did in solitary, and yet it has this multiplicity to it, right? And that sort of unity and multiplicity is like the Vedantic notion of the divine, right?
right,
And that's sort of like the religious underpinning of it, but it's also relates to reincarnation, which is another religious underpinning to it, which is that, you know, if you believe that you've been born, you know, thousands of times in the past, you will be born thousands of times in the future. You are all those past selves and all those future selves, even as you are your own self, and you have no knowledge of them. But you know your one self, but you have all of this karmically in your background, you know, and you have it karmically in your future as well, you know, all these other selves. And so there's no human being, no creature, no bird of the sky, no fish of the sea that you might not have been in the past, right?
right,
That's one of the elements of the, you know, Vedantic or Hindu
right.
thought that is very, very attractive to me. And so one of the central sort of, I think the central sequence in the book is called Letters to Myself in My
Yeah,
Next
yeah,
Incarnation, right? And that is probably one of the hinge points of the book. It's very dear to me because it's such an ambitious sequence.
right,
And it kind of tethers all of those different selves that you see at work in the book. And I think, you know, the structure of the book is very organic, which is that at no point writing any one of those poems did I think, I'm going to write a collection and put it right here. You
right,
know,
right.
I just wrote all this stuff as it came naturally to me for a period of time.
Mm-hmm.
And then I took the ones that had been basically published in magazines, right? Or
Right,
journals. And then I kind of was like, okay, how are we going to arrange these? And then they just naturally, different aspects of my personality and my background had clearly been responsible for one or another given set of poems. So there's a certain Midwestern self that comes out, Indian American Midwestern self that comes out early on. And that's like one of the early section, you know. There's the Hindu translator of the Gita who is probably largely responsible for Letters to Myself in My Next Incarnation.
right.
There's sort of politically aware self that is more responsible for Godra sequence, which is about, you know, some riots that occurred in Gujarat early in the century.
I loved that poem. That's one of my
Yeah,
favorite poems.
so there's all these different selves, you know, and there's also poems, some of them about science, you know, virus and everything like that. That's, you know, so I kind of was able to learn a lot about myself and a lot about the different types of self that write my poems, you know, that write the poems that go under my name. It's almost as like there's more than one me doing
Right.
that. So I even have, you know, those initial triolets. They're all triolets that I preface each section with.
Right.
You know, I even talk about that. You know, I talk about, you know, how they're all those triolets focus on the I, you know, the I, the self.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that's their unitary theme, which then are used to preface each one of the sections. And so that's I think that's the book really taught me a lot about myself, just putting it together, which is that I should probably refer to myself as myselves, you know, plural.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, you know, it's funny because, I mean, I think you were successful in, you know, I know you didn't set out to do this, but in this journey, you talk about, I mean, Letters to Myself in My Next Incarnation, about how that sort of is the turning point of the book. And that's what I felt when I read it. That's exactly what I experienced. And so up till that point, you know, I mean, I was really enjoying the book, but I'm like, oh, whoa, wait a minute, what's happening here? And usually when people read a poetry collection, they don't read it from beginning to end. They like to, you know, dip in and dip out. But I mean, I was going to be in conversation with you. I had to read it. And then, you know, when I was reading it, I wanted to read it from, you know, the beginning to the end. And I'm so glad I did, because it gave me, you know, a different perspective. And it gave me this beautiful aerial view, right? And
Yeah,
so,
and I think putting that sequence at the center kind of does have like a hinge sort of
right.
aspect. So you're kind of like coming, and then you're going to another, you know. Yeah, there's definitely a progression. When I did construct the book, I constructed it as a book, you know,
Right.
with that in mind. And I'm glad that you know you're able to experience that for sure.
Yeah. And so I want to talk a little bit about the way you write, you know. And you told me that you've taken some classes, but I mean, I mean, you didn't do an MFA or anything, right? I mean, this is something you self-study and what you've been doing for years and
Right.
years.
I was, yeah,
Right.
I'm not really, I've almost done no formal study of poetry or literature, anything like that. And that, you know, I did at one point take an introduction to poetry class, but I really hated it because at that particular point in my development, I was very retro in my tastes. And like, I
Okay.
was like, you know, very much into, and you can still see this, but I'm very much into like form and rhyme and different
Right,
meanings.
right, right. Which is
It's rare. It's not typical. It's actually very rare in the contemporary world, in
right.
English language poetry, and actually in other languages as well, to be
I
honest with you.
love rhyme. I love rhyme. I do a lot of internal
It's
rhyme in
great.
my
It's
stuff
actually
too.
this wonderful compositional aid too. And but that was not necessarily where my contemporaries are at. And so I was in an environment where that was like not even in anyone's mind. And so I was like, you know, I don't want to learn poetry. I don't want to learn to write poetry like this, you know. So
Right.
like, why am I here? And so I was like, and then I just didn't feel like I was a good fit there. And so that was, you know,
Well,
so then I never took a poetry class. So I was just like, I don't want to learn this type of poetry. I don't want to learn from these
right,
people.
right.
And I don't want these people influencing, because it's like often a workshop environment. And I was like, I don't want that. I'd rather fail in my own way than, you know, than succeed on those terms, you know. I've eased up since then. Now I write poems of every which style, every which way, every which tone,
Yes,
and every.
which, and in fact, that I wanted to talk about that there's so much wordplay in your poems, and internal and end rhymes, and you know, you break up your lines in, you know, couplets and tercets, and I really see this reverence for form, you know. But
I'm obsessive about it. Yeah.
yeah, and you have, but in this book, you have prose poems, you have ghazals, you have list poems, but you also have this form, which was in Dothead as well, a delightful new form which fuses the sonnet and the ghazal, and you call it a sanzal. So,
Right.
how did you stumble upon the sanzal? And yeah, tell us, you know.
Yeah. You know, so the Sanzal was just, I was doing a lot of work in the ghazal. So I've written so many ghazals. I mean, they're not publishable, but there was a long period of time where I was trying to adapt the ghazal into English. And this is years ago. And I would just knock them out, just trying to get the feel down and trying to figure out, you know, the different ways in which I could modulate all of this. And so um, the ghazal can be any number of couplets, and often
Right.
in English shorter because rhymes are a little bit scarce compared to Persian or Urdu.
Mhm.
But um, I noticed that if you wrote like a 7 couplet ghazal, it is simultaneously the same length as a sonnet. And then I thought, and then just very randomly, I thought that what if you had 2 different refrains? And after the initial octet of the sonnet, you
Right.
switch the refrain into something related to that initial refrain. And so one of the ones that I have in Dothead is called, you know, the one refrain is pattern, and the
Mhm.
second refrain is snarl, which is kind of like a snarled up area, you know, element of the
Right,
pattern.
right, right, right,
And that was just kind of like this idea that just kind of came naturally from an endless tinkering with the
right.
form. And then I was like, well, I guess the only thing left to do is to make the unrhymed lines of the ghazal's couplets rhyme with each other, so that the whole thing rhymes the way a sonnet rhymes. And then basically you have a poem that meets the criteria of a sonnet while simultaneously meeting the criteria of a ghazal. And that's very difficult to attain, but it's worth a shot. And if you can attain it, it's kind of like squaring the circle, you know?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Would you read one for us? I
Yeah,
think it'd be
sure. So
awesome to hear one.
this one's from Dothead. It's called Pattern and Snarl. And the reason I picked this one is because, you know, the Sanzal is so focused on, you know, it's such a pattern that you have to like meet that it's natural that a poem about patterns would fit because, you know, that's basically, you know, it's self-reflexive in that way. Life likes a little mess. All patterns need a snarl. The best patterns know how best to heed a snarl. Every high style, every strict form was once nonce. The best way to save a snagged pattern? Repeat the snarl. Eden used to snow in fractals, rain in syncopated runs. Adam never imagined he would hear its seedling snarl. Tug the wrong thread, and your wool sweater vanishes at once. Death pulls at a wisp of us, and just like that, it's freed the snarl. What is it about order that we love? This sense, maybe, that a secret informs the pattern. Is it a toddler's joy in doing things again? Is it the entropy in us that warms to pattern? I never intended this line to rhyme on again, again. Then again, sometimes it's the snarl that adorns the pattern.
Thank you. That's so beautiful. And I can see that. And there's so much artistry and, you know, bringing these two forms together, and it's amazing. And who knows, maybe they'll be teaching the Sanzal, you know.
I don't know. I doubt it. I think if a form to be successful and kind of take off and propagate and go viral, it has a certain simplicity and ease to it, you know. And I don't think that, and so basically beginning poets need to be able to produce examples of it that are passable easily, quickly. And I think the Sanzal is something that I attained or was able to write very late, you know, in my development, and I'd written all sorts of stuff before that. And you know, unless, you know, I would be surprised if it took off, because it doesn't have the characteristics necessary for something to take off like that. You know, it's very difficult. It's difficult. It's a difficult.
Right. It seems like, you know, a poet's form, like, you know, a Canadian poet. I mean, I saw it and I loved it. I was like, oh my God, this is something I really want to try. And when I do, I'll let you know.
Yeah, no, please send it to me. I'd love to see someone else writing a Sanzal. I've never seen anyone else write a Sanzal. I'm the only one.
No, I will definitely take a stab at it or a crack at it. I mean, actually, even a ghazal, even though, like, you know, I've been listening to ghazals since I was young, I used to sing them. It was not easy to write a ghazal, you know, it was not.
Not in English, sure. Not in English for sure. I mean, it's not, I mean, I feel like I can turn them out at this point. I mean, I don't know how good they'd be, but like, practice does help. Practice definitely helps. Like, if you write a whole bunch of them, just not trying to show them to anybody, not trying to get them published, just try and get that form and that sound down in English. It becomes easier, I think, over time, in my experience, at least.
So I think we are running out of time now, but I, you know, I don't know if you're sick of reciting this poem. As you can see, I am a dothead. If you know, I don't know. I know that that's a slur, but I loved how you reclaimed this slur in your poem of the same name. And also how it's sort of like flipped gender also, because, you know, bindis are usually worn by women. But I was here in the United States when attacks started happening in New Jersey and other places, and hearing the term dothead, right? Where women wearing bindis were attacked here in the United States. So when I read your poem, and that's how I first came to learn of your work, it was, I read the poem Dothead, and I think I saw you gave a TEDx talk or something like that, right? Yeah, and you read the poem, and it's such a fantastic poem. It's one of my favorites. Would you mind reading it?
Sure, yeah. So I usually, before I read it, I always tell audiences about who Shiva Nataraja is. No one who's going to be listening to this needs to know about the Tandava Nritya or anything like that. You guys already know about that. I don't have to introduce it at all. this dot head. Well, yes, I said. My mother wears a dot. I know they said third eye in class, but it's not an eye, not like that. It's not some freak third eye that opens on your forehead like on some Chernobyl baby. What it means is, what it's showing is, there's this unseen eye on the inside. She's marking it. It's X that says that. It's not the treasure, but as good as treasure. All right. What I said wasn't half so measured. In fact, I didn't say a thing. Their laughter had made my mouth go dry. Lunch was after world history. That week was India, myths, caste system, sati, all the greatest hits. The white kids I was sitting with were friends, at least as I defined a friend back then. So wait, said Nick, does your mom wear a dot? I nodded, and I caught a smirk on Todd. She wear it to the shower and to bed? While Jesse sucked his chocolate milk and Brad was getting ready for another stab, I said, maybe that ketchup packet there. And Nick said, what? I snatched it, twitched the tear, and squeezed a dollop on my thumb and worked circles till the red planet entered the house of war. And on my forehead, for the world to see, my third eye burned those schoolboys in their seats, their flesh in little puddles underneath, pale pools where Nataraja cooled his feet.
Awesome. That is just fantastic. Amit, and tell me how to say your last name, because a lot of people were saying Majumdar, and I'm like, no, it's not Majumdar. And please tell me, is it Majmudar?
No, Majumdar is a Bengali last name. It's a common. Majumdar is actually a common Bengali last name.
Exactly.
Majmudar is an uncommon Gujarati last name. So we're actually Gujaratis.
Yes, that's exactly what I thought. And is it Majmudar or Majmudar?
Majmudar. But when the thing is, like, for whatever reason, like when I pronounce it in America, it's like I just say Majmudar, and that's just natural to me. When I'm like, it's like there's two pronunciations of my own last name. But when I'm speaking English to Americans, I'm like Majmudar. But when it's like when I'm around, Gujaratis, fellow Gujaratis or Indians, then I'm Majmudar. The authentic true pronunciation is Majmudar if you look at the way it's spelled in Gujarati. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I want to say congratulations on what he did in Solitary. And, I'm going to continue, of course, like all of us, we know there are going to be more books to come. I mean, you're a fantastic writer, and what an imagination. I mean, your work is so powerful. And
thank you so much. And thank you for having me out here. And thank you to the Poetry Festival.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay.